Feeling left out can hurt. Picked last for baseball, sitting alone at lunch, hearing about a birthday party that everyone except you got to attend. It's a rotten sensation. And unfortunately, the best way to salvage your pride is to just do nothing. Move on. But what happens when the effects of being left out are a bit more acute than hurt feelings? What if, because of this exclusion, the livelihood and relevance of the place you resided was at stake? Such a scene began to unfold in late 1800s Jacksonville, Oregon. But this isn't just a story of a town that got left out. The tale of the Rogue River Valley Railway is about a response to the indifference that was something other than just moving forward, and how it eventually fizzled out.
It's a story of failure, and that's always hard to tell. We like our stories to be something that had a golden age and maybe had a decline later.
Before the railway changed everything, Jacksonville had been the county seat. First established in the early 1850s, gold and rich farmland were the original draws.
It was a mining camp. And where the miners go, you find the merchants and the hangers-on. They follow shortly behind. But also, you found that this was a beautiful valley with a lot of fertile land. The government was giving donation land claims. So if you were single, you could have 160 acres. If you were married, you could have 320, provided you farmed them for 5 years and built some sort of housing structure. And so the settlers were right behind. And since you already had sort of a little established tent city, really is what it was here, this became the hub. And it grew from there.
This growth had a temporary slowdown in 1873, after a major fire pummeled much of the town's business section. Much of what was burned was rebuilt, and work on the new Oregon and California Railroad had already commenced. Construction began in Portland in 1868 and extended to Roseburg by 1872. Following a pause, it continued advancing south, and by 1884 it would extend into a flat portion of the Rogue River Valley, a location which would be referred to 5 years down the line as a former bare spot in the Oregonian newspaper. That bare spot was the cradle of Medford. Several property owners, including Medford founders Iredell Phipps and C.W. Broback, the latter would later commit the first killing in Medford, though he claimed self-defense, granted a portion of their land to the O&C Railroad so that a depot might be built there.
Oregon Sentinel, November 3, 1883. The Grand Central Railroad Depot has been located at last, and the company have decided on putting it on the land owned by C.W. Broback, C. Mingus, C.C. Beekman, and I.J. Phipps. It is on a corner owned by the four above-mentioned parties, but the depot property will be on the land owned by Broback. A town site will be laid out and property offered for sale.
And they donated this land to the railroad, and also as a place where they could have a depot and whatnot there. They kept a portion of it. In fact, with the Oregon and California lands, you'll find their checkerboards. It's like a mile square here, a mile square there. Part went to the government, part went to the railroad, part which eventually then defaulted to the government. Part was kept up for private ownership. So the ownership gets very, very interesting.
Jacksonville was bypassed completely, as its location was not suitable for the tracks to maintain a relatively straight line as they continued south. And so, Jacksonville sat, its hilly terrain passed up for the flatter valley floor just a few miles away, left out of the grand transportation modernizing plan. But while Jacksonville had been bypassed, it wouldn't just move on either. Before the O&C rails even reached Ashland, its citizenry began to make plans and raise funds for a $20,000 endeavor, their own railroad. And by 1890, their brainstorming and capital-raising efforts began to materialize.
Once the citizens learned that the Oregon and California Railroad was going to bypass Jacksonville, they said, we can't have this happen. We have to maintain our prominence. And they thought that building this little spur railroad would do it.
Jacksonville Democratic Times, October 3, 1890. It is with no small degree of satisfaction that we announce this week that the branch railroad from this place to Medford will be built, and that without delay. The contract for its construction has been duly executed and returned by Crawford Howell and Company, who have assured our citizens that their order has been placed for new steel rails and contract signed for the delivery of the same at Medford, which is also confirmed by Honeyman, DeHart and Company, who will furnish the rails. The former also pledged themselves that grading will commence as soon as arrangements can be made for it. The unequivocal manner in which they announce, "We will build a railroad," is refreshing to those of our citizens whose hearts were almost sick with deferred hope. This little 5-mile connecting link between our foothill belt and the Overland Railroad is of far more consequence than the casual observer would suppose. It means that the county seat and its environs will once more be placed on an equal footing with other sections that have heretofore thriven largely at our expense.
Hope was in the air. At first, anyway. On December 12, 1890, a line in the Jacksonville Democratic Times noted, quote, "The new year will be inaugurated by the completion of the Jacksonville-Medford Railroad." A week after the Democratic Times' New Year's optimistic declaration, the tune changed.
Jacksonville Democratic Times, December 19, 1890. It is announced that Crawford, Howell & Company are unable to proceed with the building of the Jacksonville-Medford Railroad and have abandoned their contract. Several carloads of rails are at Medford, but as the freight on them was not paid, the railroad company would not deliver them. This, of course, blocked operations. Mr. Honeyman of Honeyman, DeHart & Company, Portland, who furnished the rails, is here, and it is probable that arrangements will be made to complete the road. Crawford, Howell & Company have spent a very small amount of money, not having paid anybody or for anything. How they expect to build this road without employing some capital of their own is a mystery. Albany Morning Daily Herald, January 7, 1891. The first train over the Jacksonville-Medford Railroad did not arrive on New Year's Day as expected, says the Democratic Times, although an attempt was made to bring it in. The road is completed between the towns, but the rolling stock has not yet put in an appearance.
When it was built extraordinarily cheaply. The typical rail used at the time on mainline railroads was 50 to 60 pounds steel. When this railroad was built, they opted for 26-pound steel, which is basically sort of streetcar track or track might be used in mines or something. And then they put them on standard gauge, which meant that tracks were very widespread. And the whole arrangement was so flimsy that when the track was first opened and they tried to run a Southern Pacific engine on it, it only got a few feet before the track splayed out and the engine came off on the ground. It couldn't carry the weight of a full-size engine.
After the initial discouraging news that the railroad would not come to Jacksonville, and the problem-laden road traveled during the town's efforts to build its own, the dream materialized, as did a name.
Jacksonville Democratic Times, February 13, 1891. The parties now owning the railway between Jacksonville and Medford have formed a corporation, known as the Rogue River Valley Railroad Company. They are putting everything in new first-class order and will soon have a good road in every respect. Their new rolling stock will be put on the railroad as soon as completed. The first regular trips were made yesterday and proved quite successful. The following crew is in charge of the train: Mr. Ridenauer, engineer, Will Ferrier, fireman, and John Dyer, conductor. The fare is only 20 cents each way, but what the freight charges will be, we have not learned as of yet. It is to be hoped that the enterprise will prove a remunerative one.
The rail line's depot was located at the corner of Oregon and C Streets, the current site of Jacksonville's Visitors Center. The first official engine to lead the 5.5-mile trek across the rails was dubbed, rather practically it would seem, Engine Number 1. Not that its small stature didn't invite a handful of nicknames, too, monikers that sound suited for guest stars on the Little Rascals TV show. Tea Kettle, Peanut Roaster, Jacksonville Cannonball.
So it was a commuter engine, and the basic idea was to use it as moving a single-passenger combination coach car between here and Medford and back. Operations are very small. They had eventually as many as 4 engines, but probably never running more than a couple at a time. They had 1 or 2 box cars, a couple flat cars, and eventually they had 3 passenger coaches, but they seldom used them except for excursions. And there are occasions when they could run trains, their own trains, as far as Ashlands, like for a baseball game or something.
Ownership would change multiple times during the railroad's tenure, with a notable standout.
Generally a man named W. Barnum, who was a mill operator, but early on, about 93, after leasing the railroad for a couple months, the company was leasing it from the original founders of the line, were happy to sell their $20,000 railroad to him for $12,000, and he took up the bid. He lasted until about 1900, at which point he had to then sell it off to another party, and he comes and goes over time.
John, one of Barnum's sons, became a bit of a celebrity, with the teenager serving as the railroad's conductor.
Medford Mail, November 24, 1893. Conductor Barnum likes his work and says that he gets along nicely except with some of the very smart drummers who are often on his train and who guy him about his inability to handle their heavy baggage. He had an amusing experience with a big fellow not long ago, but came out ahead and earned the hearty applause of a trainload of people. The big fellow thought it would be smart to play a trick on the little conductor before the crowd, and when called on for his fare, said he had lost his ticket and was out of money. Johnny knew better, but told the smart party that he must pay his fare or get off. This was sneered at, and the conductor passed on, while his would-be deadbeat snickered over the joke. Soon afterward, the conductor slipped up behind the fellow, seized his hat, and put it in the express chest in the baggage compartment, calmly locking the chest. The big drummer followed him and demanded the hat, but was quietly informed that it would be held until he had paid his fare. Before the train reached its destination, the fare was paid, and the hat surrendered to its owner, who sneaked away amid the jeers of the crowd.
I have various stories of whether he was 13 or 14 years old, but yes, he was touted as, in fact, as being the youngest conductor in the nation.
In reality, the elder Barnum did much of the legwork.
He was able to start the train slowly, walk to the passenger car, get on the car when the train's running itself, collect the money for the tickets, get off the car, get back on the engine, and finish the run.
Passengers weren't the only commodity to board the Rogue River Valley Railway cars. Over time, it became a true jack of all trades.
There's a little development in its commercial aspects. For the first few years, there's a brick kiln about a mile out of town to the west of here, and that gave the train some service, freight going one direction. Later on, there's the famous Op mine in about 1910, gets the line extended out to it, and that's about 2 miles out of town in the same direction. And there's also some timber harvesting that goes out. Newspapers would talk about the tremendous timber stands that they were harvesting, but there really wasn't that much, and it really didn't last that long.
The railroad contended with other issues, too.
In 1907, they were still using the 26-pound original rail, but by 1912 or so, it had been replaced with 56 pounds per yard steel. And then we had the makings of a first-class railroad, but they could never afford to maintain the tracks. The cars were always in pretty bad shape. It'd go about 6 to 9 miles an hour. Barnum was required by the State Railroad Commission to put a station house on either end. He did, but then he leased it out to somebody to use as lunch counters. In Medford, the station was there, but the passengers would walk over the tracks to the Southern Pacific Station, because at least they could get inside in bad weather.
Nearby Medford continued to boom. The O&C Railroad Depot turned out to be like a rock tossed into a pond, the resultant ripples manifesting as buildings, homes, and streets pushing ever outward. By the early 1900s, it was one of the fastest-growing cities in the United States, thanks to plentiful orchards, and a few other adornments trumpeted by local media, including the railroad that started it all.
Medford Mail Tribune, April 26, 1910. Medford is the largest fruit shipping point in Oregon, and its freight and passenger business exceed that of any station on the Harriman lines in the state except Portland.
A shortcoming of the Jacksonville scheme is the builders of the railroad never acquired any property to develop real estate. They didn't have a business plan. They just had a hope that if you ran a railroad back and forth, things would happen. By 1915, other initiatives were coming up. The line to Butte Falls had already been built by another line. The people in Medford were looking for a traction company, which means streetcars. And about 1913, the streetcar company in Medford purchased the line from Mr. Barnum and eventually electrifies the whole thing. That lasts until about 1925, when everything ends. Barnum has now received the railroad again. He has to have the track ripped up, which he can sell, which he does, and that's the end of the line.
It did the job of maintaining the hub for some period of time, but more and more as the traffic was coming through Medford, the merchants moved over, the settlers followed. The steam railroad ran out of steam.
A few years later, Jacksonville ceased to be the county seat, that role shifting to Medford. The final court trial held in Jacksonville was for the Doutremont brothers, a trio found guilty of the deaths of 4 men during a violent train robbery at the Southern Pacific Railroad's Tunnel 13, located in the Siskiyou Mountains. And so, a long slide that started with trains also ended with one.
And that pretty much was the death knell of Jacksonville, because before that, all county business had to come to Jacksonville. So even though it was a small town, it was in the catbird seat, so to speak, in terms of where the lawyers would have to come.
Because the railroad bypassed Jacksonville, it essentially became a ghost town. It became literally the wrong side of the tracks, but as a result, it did not get modernized. And so all of the historic buildings were preserved, and as opposed to being replaced by 1950s post-World War II structures. And so what we have, as a result, we have the National Historic Landmark District that has over 100 buildings listed on the National Historic Register. And it was the first group of buildings to be listed from the West Coast to be listed on the National Historic Register. We have this wonderful historic district that has a lot of stories to be told.
National Register of Historic Places nomination form. Jacksonville Historic District is the state's most extensive and complete example of a late 19th century inland commercial and mining community. Jacksonville is nearly unique in that its fabric, its scale, and spatial relationships have survived. In 1873, a fire destroyed much of the business section, but the town was at once rebuilt. However, by the late 1870s, decline was noticeable, and after the railroad bypassed the town 4 miles to the east in 1884, Jacksonville became a dormant town. The final blow was struck in 1927 when the county seat was moved to Medford.
In the end, the short-lived Rogue River Valley Railroad was, in a way, part of the reason for Jacksonville's historic preservation. That includes some pieces of the railroad itself, lengths of track still in the ground next to the Visitors Center, and a rebuilt Engine Number 1, or peanut roaster, or tea kettle, or Jacksonville Cannonball, if you prefer, which sits proudly near the Bigham Knoll campus. It's its own unique version of a spur railroad, the same old train, now linking past to present.
Medford Mail Tribune, October 28, 1951. A few stories about those days still survive. One is about the traveling salesman who was riding to Jacksonville one day and was annoyed at the speed of the train. "Can't you go any faster?" he demanded of one of the Barnums. "I can," came the prompt reply, "but I have to stick with the train." In dark ages, since many years have passed, 6 miles an hour was considered pretty fast. But now, in 1909, that's some speed on Barnum's line. Same old wheezing engine and car, starts for Jayville with an awful jar. Foxy Barnum rents his whole depot and makes us wait out in the snow. It's just that same old train that's running. It's just that same old jerky way. No wonder we're always kicking at the price we have to pay. Oh, won't you tell me when we'll get there? Oh, won't you use a little more wood? Same little jolly, it gives one a pain. Same little jerky, same old train.